financing for the SDGs, which will focus on green and innovative financing solutions and see how such more market-based mechanisms can be used more effectively to also finance the SDGs. Before we start, I have to make some housekeeping announcements. As you know, here on Zoom, please keep your microphones on mute when not speaking and minimize background noises like notifications, like mine. When you do speak, please speak slower than you usually do to help our interpreters. Please mute the floor language when you speak to avoid an echo effect. And then feel free to turn on your camera when you do speak to facilitate interaction. If you have any questions or suggestions during the session, please send them to the main chat. We will moderate it and collect your questions and direct them to the moderator. And if you have a problem or a question, you can also raise your hand or put it into the chat. At the end of the session, we will have a short evaluation form. We will send the link, and we would appreciate if you could complete it, including the speakers. And now I have to make an official disclaimer on behalf of the interpretation services. The remote simultaneous interpretation of the proceedings is provided by the United Nations for the purpose of facilitating communication in light of the fact that there are 6 official languages of the United Nations. Participants are requested to be mindful of the additional difficulties experienced by interpreters when working in remote mode and of the increased likelihood of disruptions to the audio feed to the interpreters. Only the speech or intervention in the original language is authentic and constitutes an authentic record of the proceedings. In case of any inconsistency between the interpretation and the speech or intervention in the original language, the latter shall prevail. Interpreters servicing remote meetings cannot be held liable for interruption of service, pixelation, freezing or loss of visual inputs, partial or complete loss of audio, audible artifacts, unauthorized access to personal or confidential data, leaking of information due to inadequate soundproofing, and or data loss. And with this announcement, I would like to hand over to our moderator for the session today, Ms. Denise Sumpf, Head of Resident Coordinator's Office of the United Nations in Armenia. Denise, the floor is yours.
Vielen Dank. Thank you, Natasha. And I'm quite mindful that German is not an official language of the UN. And I would already in advance extend a big thank you to the translators who are providing simultaneous translation for this meeting. I'm particularly happy to see you all this morning. It's a quite sunny day in Yerevan, even a bit cold. But it's the right conditions to talk about, I think, SDG financing and public investment and the financial ecosystem that supports us towards the achievement of the Agenda 2030. And I'm saying that I could go through the Session 7 concept note, financing the SDGs, closing financing gaps through application of new sustainable financing instruments. But I'd rather give you sort of my personal motivation for joining this session as a moderator. Here in Armenia, we have just signed in June the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, which is the strategic guiding umbrella document for development cooperation over the next 5 years. And it's a joint responsibility towards implementation of programmatic priorities for Armenia and for the people in Armenia to achieve the national priorities, national development priorities, as well as the sustainable development goals. Now, a big part of this, or a big part of the work that we're facing now, together with our colleagues in government and other stakeholders, is to develop a viable and tenable funding and financing framework. And based on that, then to develop a resource mobilization strategy that really leverages the different capacities, the expertise, and also the available resources of different partners. So here I'm looking really at the role of capital markets. I'm looking at innovative financing investment instruments. We might be talking about bonds later on in the session, but also we're looking at country-based pool funds and other tools and instruments that will be very useful. You might be aware that the context in Armenia has been particularly challenging. I mean, globally, we all went through or we're still sort of going through the COVID-19 pandemic, and are collectively trying to assess the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic. In Armenia, we also face the repercussions of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So the already shrinking budget revenues or the shrinking fiscal space of the government suffers additional shocks. And we need to really think in a practical way how the ideas that I hopefully glean from the panelists today, that I glean from the presentations today, will translate into actionable programs so that we can develop financing and funding strategies together with our partners, be they IFIs, be they other stakeholders, to really achieve the Agenda 2030. Now, I'm realizing on the agenda that I'm actually only allocated like 2 to 3 minutes for the introduction. And time management is an art, not a skill. So I will limit this introduction to these few words and sort of invite you to really keep the practical country context in the backs of your mind. And I'm sure that while I'm speaking sort of about the realities in Armenia, you experience the realities in your respective countries, and also the colleagues whose presentations are following, providing a more regional overview, really keep the realities in their minds on sort of when we then feed the results of our discussion into the Sustainable Development Forum, the regional forum, as well as into the high-level policy forum next year. Now, without further ado, I see Patrick already ready to go with the right background. I can very well read the ESCAP 75. Allow me to introduce Patrick. He is an environmental law and finance specialist, and is working with the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. And maybe I should add here that I hold a particularly warm space in my heart for the Economic and Social Commission in Bangkok, because that was my first UN duty station, and it was a great start into a long career so far. But back to Patrick. He, as I said, has 2 decades of professional experience in the Asia Pacific region, including legal practice, international development, and also investment banking. So I have high hopes to get really a comprehensive view covering private sector, public sector, as well as sort of the UN perspective. I would reckon you're from Australia with a PhD from the University of New South Wales, if I'm not mistaken, and examining in his PhD the intersection of climate law and sustainable development. So I think that's one of the things that we tend to forget when the money is tight, that the environment is also something that that we should actually keep in our minds. Over to you, Patrick, before I continue to ramble on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those kind words. I'll just bring up my bring up the PowerPoint. Just confirming everyone can see that.
Confirming that we can see your slides.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent. Great. Well, thank you for those kind words, and yeah, I'll get started. So today, essentially, I'm going to speak about sustainability and SDG bonds in the broader sense. As we know, financing the SDGs in this COVID era has been difficult. You know, as Denise mentioned, the pandemic and measures to contain its spread have put both health and economic systems worldwide under severe strain. And the pandemic's economic consequences have really been unprecedented and pose a substantial risk to the Sustainable Development Goals. And as a result of the pandemic, many governments, both across the entire Asia-Pacific region, but particularly in the region we're speaking about today, have experienced, you know, considerable squeeze on their fiscal resources, making it really difficult to undertake the actions necessary and needed to recover in line with the 2030 agenda. So with that, you know, these slides just sort of highlights some of that deteriorating fiscal balance, the adverse effects, and that we need to really ensure that the recovery is sustained over time with substantial amounts to support the SDGs. In this context, just because I'll be talking a lot about sustainable finance more broadly and the SDGs, this slide just really highlights it's a bit of a simple taxonomy or classification system, just identifying the sorts of activities that deliver key, be they climate or green, environmental, social or sustainable objectives. And it aims so we can help to understand, because this becomes a bit of a key issue as we speak more about different financial instruments, that we can see that it's sort of divided up. And that we can see, you know, this, as I say, this type of classification. So to accelerate the progress in achieving the SDGs, public finance, for the reasons I spoke about before, you know, potentially are not enough. And essentially, we need to try, what I'm arguing is this need to, where possible, and it's not always possible, it's really an issue of engaging with this. It's not a sort of this must be done, it's more how can we do it and how can we engage. But this need to potentially mobilize capital markets to leverage private investment in the SDG goals. So, and specifically I'll speak about green, social, sustainability and SDG linked bonds could potentially act as a conduit, enabling bond markets to be this sort of powerful catalyst to address the SDGs and to build better in response to the pandemic. As you know, governments have really continued to strive to meet their SDGs, but even before the pandemic, it was recognised that across the region was not on track to sadly meet all the SDGs by 2030. So mobilisation of finance from the private sector and through potentially innovative financial strategies is potentially critical. The opportunity exists really to incorporate sustainable investment into the COVID recovery efforts, and advancing potentially this idea of growth within the thematic bond market within the region potentially is a way to unlock the resources needed to aid the COVID recovery and advance the 2030 agenda, linking investors interested in factoring in the SDGs in their investment decision making and borrowers that need funds for the SDGs. As such, these type of bonds that I will, the bonds that I'll talk, why is that not happening? Sorry. These thematic bonds that I'll speak about are potentially one type of instrument that have been developed. So what am I? Essentially, thematic bonds are essentially debt securities, just like traditional fixed income bonds, issued on the condition that the funds obtained are used in this case, to finance projects that'll have a social or environmental impact. As I say, like traditional fixed income bonds, in the past, we saw, you know, it was basically bonds were issued for general use, where this is for particular uses. And within the discussion of thematic bonds, we sometimes, you know, there are several different types: green, social, sustainability, SDG. So for instance, green bonds use the proceeds to address environmental issues, social bonds to address social, and sustainability bonds use the proceeds potentially for a bit of both. And likewise, funds linked to SDG bonds are committed to projects that align to the SDGs. Although these bonds emerged really less than 15 years ago, the market has expanded rapidly and continues to grow. So in 2020, the market reached a milestone of 1 trillion globally in green bonds, and in terms of all types of thematic bonds reached almost $2 trillion globally. And the issuance of thematic bonds in the wider Asia-Pacific region has also been rising strongly in line with the rest of the world, particularly China and Japan, who now represent almost a quarter of global issuance. And we've seen within the North and Central Asian region, we've seen some issuances, and I'll allow other colleagues who are speaking today to expand on those. But while green bonds, and I'll show if I touch on these graphs, while green bonds essentially do still dominate within this space, as you can see from the graph, and essentially, as mentioned, sort of the focus is out of East and Northeast Asia, and not too much in North and Central Asia. Essentially, what I think is worth recognizing is that green bonds, as an example, which are the majority of these sort of bonds issued globally, still represent only a small fraction, a little close to 2% of the total global bond market, suggesting considerable room for growth. But while the list of bond issuers in the region is expanding, technical capacities across countries remain uneven, and the full potential of this market remains to be fully tapped. Gaps in national capacities to issue these bonds, if addressed, could significantly help contribute to the potential for these markets to meet the financing gap needed to respond to supporting the SDGs. Okay, importantly, in the past, the definition of these types of bonds was a little bit subjective and open to interpretation, but increasingly with the development of numerous standards and frameworks under various guises. So for example, there is the ICMA principles, or the International Capital Markets Association has developed a number of principles around green, social, sustainability, and SDG linked bonds. There's also different initiatives. For example, the Climate Bond Initiative has climate bond standards. The EU has increasingly focused on their taxonomy, which has impacts for this space. And in Southeast Asia, for example, there are the ASEAN Green Bond Standards. The choice of the appropriate framework for a particular bond issue is essential for its success, as it symbolizes to the market what the bond issuer is trying to achieve, and allows the issuer to identify the investor to identify what types of bonds are being offered. While some countries do have their own national green bond, their national principles, for most countries it is often more practical to align with recognized global standards. So just to sort of focus a little bit on some of these standards, essentially some of the key elements of these is essentially broken down I'm using the ICMA principles, but essentially these core components of how the proceeds are going to be used, the evaluation of the selection process, the management of the proceeds, and ongoing reporting. Okay. So as an example.
Sorry, Patrick. May I ask everyone else who's in the meeting to please mute? Thank you. Back over to you.
Thank you, Denise. No problem. So just as an example, the issuer has to communicate clearly with investors how the projects will be, were selected, how the proceeds will be used, and the use of external audits. So just a slight difference in the types of bonds. So under the green bonds or social bonds, those funds must be segregated and cannot fund other types of activities. Under the sustainability linked bond principles, for example, funds can be used for general business of the issuer and don't need to be segregated. However, the issuer is still going to have to demonstrate a real commitment to sustainability and propose the activity, the way they're going to achieve these sustainability performance targets. And although the ICMA principles, just using that as an example, don't have an explicit link with the SDGs, as shown in the next slide, they can be mapped. It's possible to map the SDGs back to, be they the green bond principles or social bond principles, or more broadly, sustainability principles. That's just touching on a little bit of the Climate Bond Initiative and their taxonomy, just to highlight it. In terms of issuing, although the issue of these bonds, when considering doing them, it's important to consider what the bond you're seeking to achieve and what types of projects and activities will be financed. Essentially, although they're all different, they tend to have a common framework in terms of issuing and things to be considered around feasibility, selecting projects, reason for the issuance, then moving forward to these next stages of potentially the launch and post-issuance. In the interest of time, I'll just keep moving forward. I was going to highlight just one example. Back in August 2020, the Kingdom of Thailand issued their sustainability bond successfully, and that project financed the construction of mass transit in Bangkok, as well as health and expenditure and support for small medium enterprises affected by the pandemic. Again, just to highlight, sort of breaking down some of these issues that had to be considered with this issue: the use of proceeds, the evaluation and selection, the management of the proceeds, reporting, and the need for external review. So there are unquestionably challenges around using these instruments, and then they're not for everyone. It's a question of how to engage, what purpose, what benefit is possibly there. So for the region, there are some issues for different countries. The issue of functioning bond markets, bankable projects, readiness of projects to be financed, as well as local capacity and a relatively small investment size. But what I would suggest, the important thing around this is really trying to engage with the process. It's not that this is a yes or no to use these, but rather to engage. Is this a potential instrument, mechanism that countries can utilize? And to do that, I think it's important for countries to start thinking about, green and social project pipelines, consideration around recognized standards and principles, building local capacity around these issues, engaging with the regulatory and policy environment, if possible, for government to lead around strategic bond issuance, and potentially in the region, consideration of credit enhancement tools, which may be able to assist. And on that, I wish everyone good luck in today's session. And thank you very much, Denise.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Yours was the first of 3 presentations that will provide food for thought for the following panel. And I think we'll be saving all the questions for later. I've noted down a couple from my end in that regard, but I hope we'll have a lively discussion later on. And I give the floor in a second to Jens Radzinski, who is the regional lead of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategy. It's the regional center in Bangkok, I understand. And Jens's focus has been on climate finance, carbon markets, and carbon pricing. So I think it is a great extension to the presentation we've heard previously. And I understand Jens has worked also a long time at the UNFCCC in Bonn. So probably there's also another shared entry point for further discussion and questions. I wanted to add maybe, again, also against the backdrop of the Armenia situation, landlocked countries and probably also small island developing states have a very particular how should I say, characteristic for the ability to set up these instruments. So if you in your presentation or anyone later on also in the panel discussion, if we can sort of touch on these challenges as well. I see some questions, but I would also ask the audience, please post your questions in the chat. We will defer them to after the presentations and also keep them for the panel discussion. Over to you, Jens, for the second presentation.
Thank you very much, Denise. And first of all, I'd like to check if you can hear me well.
Yes, affirmative.
Yes, okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon, participants and colleagues, distinguished delegates. It's really an honor to be invited to this event and especially to the scene setting of the session. And I'd really like to thank you and ESCAP for inviting me. I will be presenting a little bit on our needs-based finance project in Central Asia and South Caucasus. It's an ongoing project, which is also done in cooperation with ESCAP here at the Bangkok office. First of all, next slide, please. Just a little bit of the background of the RCC Bangkok. That's the Regional Collaboration Center of UNFCCC and IGS. I myself still work for UNFCCC, and as Denise mentioned, I worked in the headquarters in Bonn, and before moving to Bangkok, to one of our 6 regional centers in different parts of the world. And as I mentioned, the one in Bangkok is working with the ASEAN Asia Pacific region. It's a very large geographic coverage for a very small office together with our host partner. The office, as other RCCs, were initially set up to spread the benefits of the clean development mechanism, but especially since 2015, RCCs then also have taken up a much broader role in supporting countries on different climate action towards implementation. Now mostly implementation of their NDCs. We still have a focus more on carbon markets and mechanisms. That's due to our background in the clean development mechanism. Next slide, please. Just a little bit short background of the project. So the needs-based finance project received its mandate at COP23. That was the Fiji COP in Bonn 2017, and there was a mandate, or it is a mandate, of a long-term finance mandate by the parties to explore ways and means to assist development parties in assessing their climate finance and investment needs priorities. It's important that this assessment and also the next steps then of the project is really done in a country-driven manner, and also include technology capacity building needs. And I will come also to the stages of the project and translate it into action. Sorry, I forgot when I sent you the slides that there are actually some animations, so I would also need to ask you to tip the next the space bar again. Yes, thank you. But and again, we can just skip this. I'll go through the stages on the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, I just wanted to show that this is a global project. We are working on the RCCs and the headquarters supporting a number of regional and sub-regional groups of countries in this project. Here in Bangkok, we are working with the Central Asia and South Caucasus, 8 countries. It's on the right side of the slides. The technical work is ongoing. As I mentioned, we also support work on 10 ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, LDCs in Asia and the Pacific, and in Melanesia. So altogether 4 sub-regions of the project in Bangkok. Please, next slide. And again, the project is done in 3 phases. Phase 1 is the inception and an assessment phase, then a validation and endorsement, and finally a mobilization phase. So the inception and assessment, yeah, please click through the next animations. Thank you. The assessment and inception is basically based on a desk review and country consultations. We have, of course, submissions of countries at the Secretary mostly use existing information. Also, the rest of the presentation is mainly based on this assessment. We have a validation phase with the countries to make sure that the outcome of these assessments are correctly represented. And then at the third phase, we would really work with countries on a strategy to enhance climate finance access and also bring in partners to mobilize climate finance. The Secretariat really has a supporting role, and it's an entirely country-driven process. Next slide, please. Yeah, on the background of the region, since we are here in the scene setting of the session, so Central Asia is characterized by rising temperature that have been observed and an increased number of hot days and a decrease of cold days. And based off of existing scientific literature, especially, of course, the IPCC, it's highly confident that this trend will continue and we will have a rise in average temperatures and an increase in hot and decrease in cool days, both for Central Asia and South Caucasus, a little less in the later one. Next slide, please. Then on the regional context, so in Central Asia and South Caucasus, the region represents a diverse group of countries with very different economic structure. The income levels and also size and many other parameters are very diverse. We have 4 countries that are oil and gas exporting economies: Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And 3 out of 4 inhabitants of Central Asia, South Caucasus actually live in these 4 oil and gas exporting countries. These countries also account for 87% of the economic activities of the region. What all these countries have in common is that their economies are in transition from a centrally planned economy to a market economy. Next slide, please. And you can also see this is corresponding, the economic activities corresponding to the greenhouse gas emission and NDC pledges from the region. Of course, we have the 4 larger oil and gas exporting countries representing most of the emissions from the region, and also in terms of NDC pledges, these countries have the largest way to go to decrease emissions. We have updated NDCs from Armenia, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. We also know that other countries are preparing, some trying to submit before COP or at least by the end of the year. So updates are ongoing. We also have 3 net zero pledges from Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. Next slide, please. Okay, now coming more to climate finance. The climate finance flows in the region totally between 2013 and 2018, 9.1 billion financial flows were reported. And yeah, the international public climate finance support went to a number of sectors across many sectors, and but is largely concentrated in the energy sector, agriculture, and transport, which make up the biggest portions here. And for a number of other financial flows, there was no not specified or kind of combined under other. There's no breakdown. Next slide, please. Yeah. As you can see here, mitigation activities highly dominate or the finance flows mitigation highly dominates the climate finance in the region. Actually, 76% on went to mitigation, only 19% on adaptation, and 5% for cross-cutting activities. Though we can also see that there is an increasing trend in adaptation support, but it still only makes up a fraction of what has received for mitigation. Next slide, please. Yeah, the multilateral development banks really make up the largest portion here on bilateral channels. Yeah, it was reported. 80% now. I'm sorry, 80%, close to 80% for multilateral development banks, and only 20% to bilateral climate finance support. You can also see, if we look at the types of needs that was communicated, that was at the bottom of the slides. It's suggested that really the largest need of climate finance is for capacity building, followed by finance and investment and technology transfer. There are also other more cross-cutting and unspecific needs. And there's also a need for policy development and MRV support. So all these numbers, as I mentioned, is basically background for the assessment of climate finance needs that build the basis for climate finance strategy at the later phase of the project. Next slide, please. Yeah, just wanted to show that the depth instruments comprise of 89%. So that's certainly the highest, by far the highest percentage here on the different climate finance instruments, and is also not seen on the slide, but I can mention that 1/3 of all the debt was concessional, and grants made up another 10% of the climate finance in the region. Next slide, please. Yeah. Again, that just kind of confirms the data we have presented in the previous slides. Really, vast majority of climate finance through multilateral development banks, and the large portion of debt instruments. Also for the bilateral support, the debt instruments make up 81%, which is also the highest portion. I have a summary of the information before. I'd also like to share.
I have to iron my shirt.
Can we move to the next slide? I have a little background noise, but
if I can ask the colleagues that are concerned with I think ironing their shirts, maybe to mute.
That's okay.
Otherwise, I'll be happy to bring some shirts over as well.
Thanks. Yeah, just in summary, before I come to a couple of aspects I wanted to mention, we will need to reflect in the work on the regional climate finance strategy. So as I mentioned, regional context, very special circumstances, and countries are actually highly vulnerable to climate change, as indicated in the IPCC reports. The climate finance flows, again, largely predominated by mitigation investments. There's still a climate finance need gap that was estimated to $3.3 billion US dollar per year. Climate finance source also mentioned, largely multilateral development banks, and 20% bilateral support, financial instruments, largely debt finance, and also there's still a large opportunities for regional cooperation that are largely untapped. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, we have done country consultations based on the assessment, based on these numbers that we've also just presented, started getting some feedback on the design of the climate finance strategy. And this is ongoing work. Also, the consultations are ongoing. I'd just like to present a couple of interesting aspects that we would need to cover, or that countries would need to discuss whether to include in the strategy. There was certainly, as also presented earlier, a large need for capacity building, so support for institutional capacity at national and regional level. Also, it was mentioned that project proposal development really need to be strengthened, partly also through exchange of experience, but also capacity building activities. And then also the knowledge and experience together experience with criteria and the processes for submission of proposals to multilateral institutions and donors needs to be strengthened. Also, climate finance expertise. What I mean here is that we have experts on finance. We have obviously also experts on climate change, but there is a lack of really this combined expertise of climate related investment, climate finance, and that's also been mentioned a couple of times, that we need to bring both the the finance and the climate change experts together. There is also planned for later events in this project. Private sector engagements is very critical, so it's challenging. Countries mentioned it's a challenging, challenging for them, but it's also very critical to involve private sector and banks, also to improve awareness on how to incorporate climate-related consideration into investment decisions really across multiple stakeholders. Also, risk profile of investment opportunities really need to better match investor appetite. So then on climate finance mobilization, we have maybe also some instruments and thoughts that need to be further considered, and by countries. There's the debt for climate swap. It's really an opportunity for the region, especially as there's really good opportunities for forest and nature protection, good carbon sink projects, also carbon pricing instruments, and of course the upcoming COP will hopefully bring us closer to implementation of Article 6 mechanisms. So that's also market-based approaches for climate finance flows. And then next slide, please, my final slide. Also, as possible areas for regional cooperation, there are, besides the trying to mobilize additional climate finance, also and finding new instruments and new sources, really to enhance the access to existing climate finance, especially also to strengthen regional initiatives. There's still a lot of opportunities. Most of the initiatives and ongoing investments are more national based, but there's of course also under this project the intention to increase and strengthen regional initiatives. There are a couple of sectors and also regions, for example, was mentioned the mountainous regions and ecosystem-based adaptation projects are some of their opportunities. And then on economic sectors that are mostly impacted by climate change would be agriculture, then of course energy, transboundary, water resources, and health. Some of them we also find in the largest and most cost-effective opportunities, such as energy, of course forestry, and then also transport is a good opportunity for cost-effective support. And we also heard from some countries the updated NDCs, of course, have included new, also the long-term climate neutrality strategies require really new technical needs assessment and also will open up new investment areas in new technologies. So the last two slides really as an outlook of the feedback we have gathered so far and of areas that we need to consider for the next phases of the project. We intend to finalize the assessment soon, help countries to formalize the strategy, and then move into the third phase, the mobilization. So probably from next year onwards, we also, of course, were quite impacted by the COVID situation in the progress of the project this year. Thank you very much. And yeah, that's the last slide. Just want to hand back over to you, Denise, and thank you again. And I can stay a little bit for questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Please do stay. We will address questions later on. I'm sure you have nothing better to do on this wonderful day. I really appreciate that you took up the thread of the sort of needs-based discussion and couching the concerns within the a specific country context. And I also appreciate that you make a good transition towards our next speaker, Martin Diezek, by highlighting sort of the priority needs for capacity building and also the institutional capacity building. Because Martin Diezek, who is the Senior Climate Finance Specialist for Europe at the International Finance Corporation, a sister organization to the World Bank. And there he is part of the Financial Institutions Group and responsible for climate investments, implementation, and advisory support to financial institutions in the region. Over to you, Martin, because I also see that you have really enormous experience with large investment volumes, and we hope we can benefit from that knowledge.
Thank you very much, Denise. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to to other regions. It's my great pleasure to be with you today, and as you said, to present also view from IFC. Without further ado, I will go directly to the presentation. Just maybe at the beginning, a little bit of introduction. IFC, as a member of World Bank Group, is one of 5 members of World Bank Group, the one which is focused on private sector development. Naturally, we have our colleagues on IBRD working with governments and subnationals, other colleagues in MIGA, in IDA, working with the poorest countries, and IFC in this World Bank family is looking at the private sector and supporting private sector through many ways. My particular department, one of 3 major departments, is focusing on financial institutions, working with banks, leasing companies, other FIs, but as well as on capital markets development and market development. So this would be just for a short introduction. My presentation is divided into 3 major parts. On a couple of overview on sustainable finance, and the second part is about role of capital markets. And I would like to show also some example from the region. They may be a little bit of overlap what Patrick was already saying, but I will work through this in pretty fast manner. So when we are looking at the sustainable finance, it's of course the business call to action. It's really a tool which allows us to finance SDGs, and it's of course one of key pillars of the process. But it is not about the money. It's really about value creation, where we need to integrate ESG with SDG agenda on every level of our economic activity. Patrick already covered where we are when speaking about sustainable finance. There are like 4 major parts in this. It's about conventional financing, climate financing, green finance, and on overall sustainable finance, which is also covering social and other aspects of our activities. I would like to stop for a while on this slide, because this is, I think, pretty good picture of the ecosystem which we are really in in terms of SDGs and in terms of our economic activity and sustainable finance. And I wouldn't start on the left side, but on the right side, where I think that's the, of course, the ultimate goal of all of us is to have finance to provide funds for real actions, projects, measures, initiatives. And that's where we are looking for project pipeline building, as Patrick mentioned in his presentation. That's the key part of our activities. We need to have financing for renewable energy, for solar distributed generation. We need to financing for energy efficiency, and so on, you name it. There is myriad of applications within sustainability space which needs to be financed. So where those financing is coming from, it's kind of in the middle, the financial sector part, which is of course showing up the commercial side of the market, meaning banks and financial institutions, which of course are playing critical role in financing, especially in the private sector, but they are of course not able to do it in their own, and I will show later some numbers on this, but they need support from capital market side and need the support from IFIs and MDBs. And here we are speaking about bonds, loans of various labels and other funding resources. So that's the middle of the financial sector ecosystem. And then of course, as on the top, there is infrastructure and regulation for sustainable finance markets. And here we are naturally speaking about various financial regulators and supervisors, governments, ministries, and so on. In the same time, rating agencies and others, and all international and national initiatives creating standards and collaboration network like we are speaking here today. So this is just, I would say, nice snapshot of the situation, where it all starts, where it should end, and what is in between, and how this ecosystem is working together in sustainable finance space. About the markets itself, we have done, it's already a couple of years ago, but we have done kind of study mapping 21 emerging markets countries in terms of how much finance they will need to achieve their to fulfill targets of their NDCs, and to basically keep climate under 1.5 degrees with climate mitigation and adaptation measures. And we came up with number about 23 trillion of climate opportunities only on those 21 emerging markets, which, by the way, represents about 1/3 of the global needs, but still it's pretty huge number. Remember, there was mention about billions. Here we are already 30 higher, and we are speaking about trillions. And as I mentioned, it's not the role only for emerging market banks. Even if they will go with their climate asset share on their portfolios to 30%, which is still very far from where they are today, which is it was 7% in 2016. I believe it can be about 10% these days, but still there is quite a long way to go. But even with this 30% of portfolios of commercial banks in climate space, it will be only about 13 trillion. So we are still having gap of 10 trillion, which needs to be fulfilled. And that's the role of debt capital markets. We have heard about the green and other labeled bond market. It's coming close to 1.3 trillion at the end of this calendar year, and it's of course growing. But there is still a huge need of further investment to flow from investment companies through bond market to recipients, and then of course end users, the pipeline of the project, as I already mentioned. IFC is of course playing some role in this. We have established recently 2 debt funds, which are focusing on emerging markets bonds, both in the financial sector as well as real company sector. But that's I think very little. Of course, there needs to be done much more. I think Patrick already covered well the structure of bond markets, which type of bonds are and what is typical for them. I would just stop here for one additional type of bond which haven't been mentioned today yet, and this is blue bonds. This is something which is emerging, especially in Asia, with their of course a proximity to ocean and seasides and ecosystems. Blue bonds are focusing on the measures which are linked to investment in ocean and water-friendly products, sustainable fisheries, seafood processing, sustainable water supply. So it's of course very important for those countries which are having a lot of economy linked to the oceans and seasides. But naturally, for landlocked countries, it's all about water treatment, clean water supply, and so on. So this is newly developing category. It's not yet been fixed by ICMA taxonomy, but it's work in progress. IFC is leading this work together with other partners, and it should be soon having its own taxonomy and guidance. So that's just on type of bonds, and we can touch upon on a further discussion. I already mentioned about growing markets. As I mentioned, the market for labeled bonds is growing. It's still well poised to reach record this year after some slowdown within the pandemic period, but it's still growing up in various segments. As I mentioned, banks are not cannot be alone in the work on sustainability finance, but they are of course essential for private sector, and we would like to of course understand where they are in terms of sustainable finance, how they understand this value proposition, what they need to support this and to grow. So we did kind of survey recently where we ask about close to 100 IFC clients in the region about their strategy, their position in sustainability finance, and we got interesting results. We were basically questioning on their portfolios, on their capacity to develop products for climate and green and so on. And we have heard that most of those clients are already doing some kind of climate-related lending. Three quarters of those surveyed are already doing this, but usually from 66%, they don't have a holistic program with some strategy or product. So it's mostly ad hoc. They have some projects in their portfolios and so on, but nothing really the strategical program. Most of them is interested, but of course, in most of cases, the slowdown also hit their desire to do green. So it's a little bit slower these days, but it's getting back as we see today. On green bonds, the question, of course, was answered that it's interesting, but 87%, so majority of FIs don't know how to do green bonds. So there is big room for capacity building and for support. And ESG is understood in this sample, but still there is need for some capacity building. So it was case of commercial banks segment. Another, of course, role is role of governments, and I think leading by example, creating incentives and motivations is also very important. That's why I choose this Georgian example as a very nice strategy towards sustainable finance. 3 years ago, Georgian National Bank of Georgia has developed a sustainable finance roadmap with 4 major pillars, where they were looking at the capacity building to strengthen sustainable finance flows. And they also incorporated ESG risk management and transparency and market discipline into the scope. And this is something which is really helping to the market to understand where the sustainable finance should go, what the key stakeholders, both financial sector as well as the real sector companies, should look at when they are thinking about green or climate or social financing. And that's I think very good example how the government or governmental institution should look at sustainable finance. There is some schedule, a lot has been already done, especially on ESG part. They have developed taxonomy, and now they are working on developing of sustainable finance guidelines and designing incentives and further regulations to stimulate sustainable finance flows. So this was just as an example of initiative at the governmental level. And if you would like to know more about the Georgian example and all other markets strategies and initiatives toward increasing sustainable finance flows, you can check with IFC Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, which is a community of financial sector regulators and agencies with 43 members. And this has been basically established for exchanging knowledge and information on developing of sustainable finance markets and regulations. From this region, we have BRSA from Turkey, we have National Bank of Georgia, we have Union Bank of Kyrgyzstan, Securities and Stock Market Commission of Ukraine, Association of Serbian Banks, and the last new member which joined a couple of weeks ago is Agency for Regulation and Development of Financial Markets from Kazakhstan. So with this a little bit of introduction of SBFN network, I would like to stop here. I hope I give you a little bit of ideas what the sustainable finance ecosystem looks like, what is the role of capital markets and various type of bonds within it, which role can play financial institutions, and what IFC is all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. You stole my thunder as I wanted to sort of summarize your presentation, but I'll take your overview also on the network and your latest member in Kazakhstan as a transition to our next component of this session. We will have a panel of eminent speakers from some of the countries, and it also links to the Georgia example that Martin just mentioned. And I'm very pleased that I'm being joined by 3 women and 1 man as speakers to reflect on the previous 3 presentations. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to Ms. Azel Nuhametova. Hopefully I pronounce the name correctly, who is at the Astana International Finance Corporation, and brings with her enormous experience also from the public sector, having previously worked at the Central Bank of Kazakhstan, as well as in the Trade Committee of the Ministry of Economy and Budget Planning of Kazakhstan. And she has been instrumental, I think, in the successful bid of Astana to host the Expo 2017. Over to you, Azel. I'm very pleased to have you here, and would kindly ask you to reflect on the previous 3 presentations, And unfortunately, also in the interest of time, to stick to sort of maybe 3-4 minutes for your reflections and comments. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Denise. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So thank you for the invitation. And I would also like to thank all the 3 speakers. They're very thoughtful and how to say it, like all-encompassing presentations about the developments of sustainable bonds and the strategies and policies in our countries. And I also would like to kind of reflect on the last slide about the Georgia developments of sustainable finance and the roadmap that they have. And also would like to highlight here that in Kazakhstan, we also have the concept and the strategy on green finance development. And we had 6 issuances of sustainable bonds, including green bonds, social bonds, and gender bonds. Like the issuers were different, the quasi-state enterprise, the ADB, so the Multi-Development Bank. And just recently, maybe 2 weeks ago, we had the first verified green loan provided by one of our shareholders, is the Eurasian Development Bank. And also I would like to say that Eurasian Development Bank operates in 6 countries and has opened a specific green economy or green finance program to invest into environmental projects in Kazakhstan and in the countries of operation. It amounts to more than 500 million USD. We had, we started preparation, so to say, the piloting of the green bond back in 2017 and succeeded in August last year with the first issuance of green bonds in Central Asia. And the funds raised went to the renewable energy project. And the first green loan, the funds went to the energy efficiency project. We also developed last year. We also developed the draft green taxonomy of Kazakhstan, but also we kind of use for our reference the ICMA rules that the first speaker was mentioning. So ICMA green bond rules, social bond rules, and sustainability bonds framework as well. And currently we are working on introducing the ESG framework on AIC in our own jurisdiction. Hopefully we'll introduce by the end of the year the ESG reporting for the listed companies on our exchange, and then maybe to spread kind of successful experience to the AIC participants. We also in May this year we've become the regional center for Belt and Road Initiatives, the Green Investment Principles, and we will be kind of the regional center for raising awareness in green investment principles and working with the second-tier banks, with commercial banks on introducing ESG policies and ES risk management. We'll also work with the Uzbekistan Bank and Kyrgyzstan banks in this area as well, apart from the work that we're doing in Kazakhstan with our regulator and Kazakhstan Stock Exchange. Yeah, so I think this is just a very brief and short kind of reflection of the 3 presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aza, for your reflections. Just for my clarification before I pass the floor, did you mention at the beginning also gender bonds, or was that, did I mishear you?
Yes, this was the ADB gender bond and the amount of 20 million USD.
Okay, I think that's a very interesting instrument. Thank you very much, Aza, for your reflections. I'll pass the floor to Ms. Katarina Sidorova, who I don't see her. Ah, yes, now I see her. Welcome to the floor. Ms. Sidorova is the head of the FICC research at Spare CIB Investment Bank and has over 15 years of experience in the financial services industry and spent especially 2 years in the debt capital markets department and 2 years in corporate lending. So she was responsible for credit analysis, structuring, pricing, and execution of public and private corporate finance transactions. And as such, I'm being told to speak slower. Apologies. I watch the time and do want to convey as much information as possible. I will speak slower. Again, Ms. Sidorova is an experienced professional in the structuring, pricing, and execution of public and private corporate finance instructions, and is a graduate from the Moscow State University and also a certified financial analyst. Over to you, Ms. Sidorova. I believe you also have a presentation or slides for your reflections. Maybe Valentin can put on the slides, or if you do that, please go ahead. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank the previous speakers for an interesting presentation and interesting discussion so far. I apologize, my slides are in Russian, but I will make my presentation in English. In my presentation, I will focus on Russian market for sustainable financing, which has been actively developing over the past couple of years. And apparently, the key drivers was implementation of SDG focused investments globally, which has been a key catalyst for Russian markets, but I think for many other emerging markets as well, especially given that most Russian major companies, including commodity exporters, are represented and integrated into international markets. And as an interesting example for the Russian markets, metals and mining companies were the first to receive ESG ratings and to attract sustainability-linked loans from European banks. Sorry, can I have the next slide, please? Currently, Russian companies are actively involved in development and implementation of ESG strategies to meet the investment criteria. On our end, in global markets, we see that investors into equity and public debt instruments are increasingly integrating sustainability criteria to the investment analysis and portfolio construction. And we see it not only in the green deals and social deals, which have been in the market so far, but also in IPO and actually every transaction which is currently on the market. Can I have the next slide, please? In terms of the size of green or social bond issuance, it seems that Russia is still lagging some of the emerging market peers. For example, if you look at the share of green social bonds in the total bonds in circulation, it is currently below 2%. And there is apparently scope for higher volumes of ESG bond issuance out of Russia. But what is interesting is that local infrastructure for sustainability themed financing has developed rapidly over the past 2 years. And currently, Russian market is seeing green and social bond placements. We've developed taxonomy for green bonds and social bonds, but at the same time, the number of companies issuing such paper is still limited. We think that new instruments such as transition bonds and sustainability-linked bonds, which I think were touched upon the previous speakers, will offer somewhat more flexibility for Russian borrowers in terms of use of proceeds and will become more attractive instruments for Russian companies. Can I have the next slide, please? In the slides, I provide some of the market data for allocation statistics for green and social bonds issued out of Russia. And apparently, we see that these are different investors which are investing into green and social bonds. So it makes sense for Russian companies to issue such instruments to assess new pockets of money. But also, as I mentioned, we see that essentially all of the existing investors starting to implement ESG strategies, which may vary a lot, and actually one of the problems of the market is that it still remains quite a fragmented market, both in terms of standards, in terms of approach of rating agencies, and in terms of investors' criteria, for example. Can I have the next slide, please? And finally, I wanted to discuss some of the challenges that the Russian market currently faces, which I think are not unique to Russia, but also present in other markets. So as I mentioned, apparently there is market fragmentation in terms of standards of issuance, investors' criteria, etc. Still, there are problems with the quality of reporting. And in Russia, for example, you're probably aware that Russian regulator is currently developing standards for non-financial reporting. In Russia, we do have problem with limited interest of local investors in SDG themed financing. As I started my presentation, it seems that implementation of sustainable strategies is predominantly being driven by international investors. But at the same time, I would mention that Russia's largest commercial banks are an exception and probably will be driving the market in Russia. For example, Sberbank is actively developing its sustainability strategy. Finally, we think that at this stage of development, it makes sense for the government to expand support measures for SDG financing, which could be a new catalyst for this market. A number of support initiatives is currently being discussed. This include tax deductions, lower capital requirements for banks and others, but no have been implemented so far. And finally, I think that some of the previous speakers mentioned this. Russian sovereign has not yet decided to come to market with SDG themed issuance, and probably they will do this. And this would be an important milestone for green financing in Russia as well, because it will establish a new benchmark for the market. And this concludes my short presentation. I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ekaterina, and thank you very much for walking us through the example of Russia and also showing us the potential to catch up to other emerging countries such as India and Mexico, who seem to be doing better in that area. Without further ado, I think we'll travel virtually to Georgia. I see Nadia Sikaradze, if I spell the last name correctly. I welcome you very much to this session. Nadia currently works as the acting head of strategic planning unit of the Policy Planning and Coordination Department at the Administration of the Government of Georgia. You must have been very busy also over the weekend with the elections and the new developments in the country. You're very much involved in the SDGs as a national coordinator and the SDG nationalization processes. So I'm very curious to hear your views, especially being a geographical neighbor. Over to you and your reflections.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and for inviting me for the conference. It's really an honor to be with you today and to talk about the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals and its financing mechanism. So I'll be quite brief, as we have quite a
I think, Nadia, we lost you. There is a disturbance in your microphone, I think.
Can you hear me now? Because
we can hear you.
It was written. Okay, great.
There's a strange background noise, but I think, I mean, for me it's okay, but...
Okay. So I will make a brief information about the process of implementation of SDGs in Georgia. So the government of Georgia is committed to the implementation of SDG, and Georgia was one of the first countries to join this agenda. Georgia was also one of the first countries that presented a national long-term review at the high-level political forum in 2016, and later in 2020. We had the second winner at high-level political forum. We have an institutional setup that was structured in 2017 when the Sustainable Development Council was established. That is headed by the administration of the government of Georgia. And under the council, we have 4 thematic group, which is social inclusion, economic development, democratic governance, and sustainable energy and environmental protection, which is co-chaired by the relevant governmental institutions and UN agencies and civil society. And for increasing of the ownership of the civil society of the process, each working group has a chairperson from governmental agencies and 2 co-chairs from civil society organization elected by the member of CSOs and 1 co-chair from UN agencies, and they have a 2-year period, and we have the rotation principle. Also the co-chairs are the part of the interagency council that participating in the decision-making process of the working in the working process. And it is anticipated that the spirit of the whole of society approaching the SDGs coordination will be further improved through the above-mentioned mechanism, created intensives for the CSOs to part of the process. As a special SDG, we also created a special SDG portal, which is SDG Gov.g, and contains all the information of the process from institutional setup until the reports and the projects. And we also integrated in this website SDG tracker, which gives us the possibility to track the progress of the implementation of all the SDGs and the targets and indicators. Currently, Georgia has 17 goals nationalized, 94 targets, and 202 indicators. And Georgia doesn't have any so this is a short information about the structuring the setup of the process. And regarding the financing of the SDG, I would say that we don't have any special mechanism for financing SDGs. The aim of the government is to align all the policy documents, all the strategies on a country level with the SDGs. And EU-Georgia Association Agreement, for example, just alone this agreement incorporates 63% of the country's nationalized SDG targets by far, the largest share of any Georgian strategy or planning documents. And this high degree of alignment shows that extent to which the European integration agenda and the 2030 agenda are mutually reinforcing each other. And moreover, the association agreement includes target missing from other national strategies. And taken together, these 36 national strategies plus Georgia-EU association agreement covers 93% of the country's nationalized SDG target, as is shown in the it's allocated various percentage according to the goals, each goals and the targets. And the process of this financing and alignment of the SDGs with the policy documents is quite crucial. And this alignment with also international commitments on the one side and with our country's budgetary planning cycle on the others led to realization on part of the administration of the government that further streamlining of the strategic objective it's clear that was needed. And for the effective implementation of the process, and the SDG needs to be more deeply integrated into the national policy process. And based on this reflection, the administration of the government of Georgia worked with the line ministries and government agencies, local and international experts, and its partner. And we established a new policy planning and coordination system in Georgia. We have the handbook now that ensures deep integration of the SDGs in a sector policy cycle. Not only any of the newly adopted strategies documents must be drafted, having in mind the linkages with the SDGs, but goals that are like listed in the logical framework should be connected with the Agenda 2030 commitments. And the logical frameworks are required for the operationalization of the strategies, align these goals closer to the budgetary planning process. So just to sum up, both like government institution priorities are subsequently explicitly or implicitly linked with the SDGs, and many projects as well are linked to more than one SDGs, and suggested that there is an awareness and understanding of the interaction of the different goals. So this is like a short information about how Georgia aligns its policy documents to the SDGs. So as I already mentioned, we don't have like a long-standing mechanism for financing the SDGs, and we're more focused on aligning it with our policy documents. It's mandatory for the state institutions which are developing the policy documents to align their policy documents to each of the goals that are connected and that are associated to these policy documents. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I really appreciate you walking us through the example of Georgia and on the nationalization and the approaches of the SDGs. Our last speaker on this panel is going to be Suren Pohosian. And I just would like to ask the audience for your indulgence to stick with this session for maybe another 15 minutes so that we can really address also some of the questions that have been raised in the chat, and that we can also afford the time to reflect for Suren. And so we're planning to finish at around, I'm trying to translate the time into Bangkok time. Not very successful here. In essence, give it another maybe 15-20 minutes, and I really appreciate your extended availability. Before I give the floor to Suren, I'd like to introduce him very briefly. He is the SDG finance advisor at the UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub, covering both Europe and the CIS region. He's a principal author of the UNDP guidebook on budgeting for SDGs, and I think that's a tidbit of information will make him a very, very important resource person for all of us when we work on our resource mobilization strategy and the funding frameworks. He has previously worked with DFID, ADB, World Bank, OECD and GIZ, and also with the UN, supporting program-based budgeting and other public financial management reforms in Europe and the CIS region. Over to you, Suren, to hear your thoughts on the topic of this session.
Thank you, Denise. I appreciate the time is short, so I'll try to be as short as possible. I would like to start with reflecting on the colleague from Georgia, because she brings in very important dimension to our discussion today, which is on governance and and actually it reflects also one of the questions in the chat box. So I would like to slightly devote some time on this governance aspect of green and climate finance in general. And if there's one message that I would like to leave our distinguished participants with from my side, is that the need for the synergized approach in dealing with all these aspects. There are a tremendous amount of interesting tools applied here and there. We have very good examples from Uzbekistan issuing SDG bonds. We have very interesting example on investor mapping done in Armenia. Georgia shows us a very good governance and coordination function, how to map the green and SDG agenda with association agreement. Lots of interesting tools. But the most important thing is how the government, how the public sector can bring all these things together in their dialogue with the private sector, in their dialogue with the banking sector. I also want to appreciate the presentations on climate and thematic bonds done before. Very interesting information. And the trends, just to link with it, is that Russia recently, the Russian government recently, literally a couple of weeks ago, adopted the green taxonomy, something similar to what EU has done and other regions have done before. Of course, I hope one day we will have a global taxonomy on these topics rather than regional taxonomies brought in, because the topic itself is global. The challenge is a global one, so global response should be much better. But still, introduction of this very important tool by the Russian government also allows individual banks like Sberbank presented today, or Gazprom Bank, or many other banking institutions to issue, and corporations to issue their bonds linking with government national priorities. This is very important topic because so far in many countries what we see is that isolated interventions on ESG by corporations, because there's a demand by the shareholders, by the consumers of that particular corporation to introduce ESG standards. But we don't see it as part of the national integrated policy response to the SDG agenda. So one particular tool that UN system and UNDP as one of the active members of the UN system are presenting to the countries in this region is integrated national financing framework. And there is one pillar about governance and coordination which actually addresses these issues very nicely. So there was a question in the chat box, what is that? What governments can do on this? My feeling is that INFF is the next generation of public governance, where the government, public, private sector, banking, international donor assistance, they are all brought into one piece. A couple of examples come why this is important, because there are already some examples where, for example, climate budget taking has presented different results from SDG budget taking. So the parliaments can be confused if these tools are not synergized, right? We see some examples from countries, without naming, that they jump to conclusion that they need a particular thematic bond. But what we also feel is that this process is driven by finance ministry with primary purpose of liquidity, solving the liquidity issue, not developmental issue, but liquidity issue. So unless the governments are proactively bringing in a coordination mechanism and synergizing mechanism to connect all these individual tools, we will be facing a lot of challenges. Just to finalize, a couple of examples also emerging from this region, where I would like to share a very interesting example for Kyrgyzstan, where one of the solutions on improving the fiscal space is right now happening in trying to align the tax expenditures with SDG agenda, with national development agenda. So it's not only about spending on green or spending on SDG, but also providing less tax incentives to those corporations that go against some of the SDG goals, like coal and other industries. France has introduced very interesting concept of this green budget tool with both positive green and negative green expenditures being tagged into the budget system. So these are sort of the examples, few examples that I just want to mention out of hundreds. And again, I want to conclude that what is the most important from my perspective is to connect all these dots into one very useful toolkit for SDG agenda. Over and I'll be happy to respond to any questions if there are, but I appreciate the time is very short. Over.
Thank you very, very much, Surin. I particularly appreciate that you picked up on the issue of good governance and the institutional responsibility with that, as there was a question also in the audience related to what will be the main elements of an efficient governance system in the respective countries to establish efficient and effective innovative financing towards the SDGs. I would like to maybe invite some of the other speakers. Again, thank you very much, Søren, for your thoughts, and I will open the floor to questions and more discussions and reflections on maybe the presentations and the thoughts that have been shared by Azel, Yekaterina, Nadia, and also Søren. And there were some questions in the chat box. I hope Amir's question on governance was satisfactorily addressed by Søren's reflections. If not, we can come back to that, and I would then maybe invite Martin or Patrick to respond as well. I see Bulat Diezekin's hand up, but I'd like to maybe touch on a question from Agapi on sort of the challenges for unmatured capital markets, and that links also to a question that I have noted for myself, given the sort of small equity component that we have at the moment. What would be sort of specifications for developing specifications in developing countries with unmatured capital markets in green financing or green bond issuance? Maybe I can invite Martin to reflect on this question.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think, of course, on the green bond regulation level, one, and I think just the first step would be to follow ICMA green bond principles, and of course there are defined principles for other bonds, which are really helping to issuers and other stakeholders to structure their green bond frameworks and really to set up the right issuance. Definitely issue is when there is not functioning the bond market itself, and that's unfortunately still the case for many of markets in the region where they are not functioning stock exchanges or general bond regulation. We see good examples for, of course, large companies issuing in other markets. We see Ukrainian companies trading in Poland. We see other countries looking at neighboring markets. So that's, of course, one way. The other way, of course, and that's, I think, coming back to our point about role of governments and regulators. It's really to build up the functioning system for strengthening the bond markets. And again, in Central Asia, we see markets like Kazakhstan up and growing, so it can play a role model for neighboring countries as well. So that's on the capital markets level, but on the sustainability and green bond itself, ICMA principles are the first hand guiding rules, I would say.
Thank you very much, Martin. Much appreciated. And I believe maybe Azel can also comment further on that. There's another question for Azel, but I would like to invite Bulat Diezekin to the floor for his question or comment. Over to you, Bulat.
Добрый день. Спасибо, Денис, за эту возможность. Я долгое время был национальным координатором от Казахстана по целям устойчивого развития, начиная с Йоханнесбурга и до него. И очень активно участвовал в различных работах по методологии и так далее. У меня замечание и комментарий один. Вот мы сейчас очень сильно увлекаемся большими деньгами, займами, бондами, инвестициями. Европейский банк, все оперируют сотнями миллионов долларов. Но если вы посмотрите, например, Алма-Ату или Астану, то вы не увидите ни одной солнечной крыши. И тех зеленых технологий, о которых говорят, они все находятся на где-то открытых полях огромного масштаба, километровые площадки. Люди по-прежнему пользуются углем и грязными технологиями. То есть люди по-прежнему, несмотря на наши воззвание, что никто не должен остаться позади, люди оказываются вне позади этих процессов, их эти процессы не касаются. И вот я скинул небольшой свой анализ по проблемам и возможным решениям целей устойчивого развития, чат. Там показано, что главная проблема – это отстраненность, невовлеченность, отчужденность людей. Спросите любого человека, ну, в лучшем случае студенты скажут, что они знают, что такие цели устойчивого развития, что их там 17, и задачи и так далее, но они их не касаются, и в их жизни их нет. И то же самое предприятия и бизнеса. Поэтому нам необходимо создавать механизмы не такие формальные, которые мы говорим участие, где мы их приглашаем на семинары или где-то на обсуждение приглашаем, а так, чтобы они как бы были акционерами своих территорий для того, чтобы они старались, чтобы развитие было долгосрочным и устойчивым, чтобы его передать своим детям, эти акции и так далее. То есть акционирование территорий, бассейновое управление – это вот те как минимум два направления, которые мы должны продвигать в большей степени, помимо, конечно, того, что вот мы привлекаем займы, бонды, финансовые механизмы и создаем большие институты. Спасибо.
Thank you very, very much, Bulat. I think it's a crucial point that you make. What are the incentives for behavioral change, and how can we frame or how can we bridge the separation between the environmental concern and the climate change question, especially in this region? I share with you the view that even here in Yerevan, also people are burning coal, and there's very few renewable energy, very few tapping into renewable energies. Maybe, and just as an added thought, I think it's the COVID pandemic that could give us an entry point for creating such incentives. If we frame climate change as an overarching health issue, and if we are realizing that our personal health and our personal individual well-being is directly affected by climate change, maybe that is an incentive for the individual ownership or the individual shareholdership in the process that you have mentioned. There's a couple more questions in the chat box, and there's one for Azel. I don't see from whom, but it's a question on how does launching a gender bond differ from launching a green bond, and whether there is already a sort of social taxonomy. And the person asking the question would like to know whether there is, if you can elaborate more on what the gender bond money will be used for, what it is allocated for, and sort of the overall purpose. Over to you, Aza.
Thank you for the question. I couldn't see it in the chat box, but anyway, so we don't have yet the social taxonomy developed. It's only about the green taxonomy as kind of the starting point of, kind of the sustainability agenda. It's all. And the gender bond was issued by Asian Development Bank, and it was issued on Kazakhstan Stock Exchange, I suppose, and we were not involved in that process, but just kind of get the statistics from there. And so I cannot get into the details of these issued bonds, but anyways, it relates to kind of social agenda, I would say. So the categories of social projects. But as for the social taxonomy, what we refer to is ICMA social bond rules, and which is based on the category, which have kind of in use of proceeds, it has the categories of certain population categories that we also use in our kind of rules and principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Azel, and also thank you very much for separately responding to another question that was in the chat box. I think Surin, also as a compliment, shared an example from gender bonds in Mexico. So I think it's an interesting approach for the countries in the region to look more into that, especially also to ensure sort of a more equal and fair representation. There's a last question. I'm quite mindful of the time, but I still would like to raise this last question and maybe again invite Martin, but also Patrick to the floor for last comments on that. And the question centers around what would be the moderate balance of financial instruments structuring for Central Asian countries, considering that in LDCs, landlocked countries and least developed countries, there's a very limited fiscal space, very limited budget flexibility. And given that also you noted that that 89% or a large proportion of the financial instruments is debt financing, in order to sort of break this cycle of further indebting already countries facing numerous challenges, how do you see or what would be your recommendation for sort of balancing financial instruments for these countries towards effective policy planning and of course towards achievement of the SDGs? Over to Martin and Patrick. Maybe Patrick first and then Martin, the last words.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. I think when we think about this, we have to think that, you know, it's not a one size fits all. Clearly, different countries have to adopt different, you know, and bonds won't be right for, you know, for some. For
Patrick, can you move closer to the mic? We can't hear you.
Yes, I'm sorry. Is that better?
I think so.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I think what we have to think about, when, you know, it's not a one size fits all. Clearly, different elements within this mix. So for some countries, rather than bonds, it might be project financing. Some countries will definitely need assistance to get different projects, particularly green and social projects, up. A mixture of concessional finance, potentially a blended finance support from different multilateral financial institutions, potentially to support that. So and not. And so it's not a one size fits all, I guess, is what I'd say. But importantly, as we've sort of touched on today, some of the challenges actually are across the board in terms of this need for identifying clear pipeline of green and social, environmental and social projects, the need for a more sort of integrated approach and mainstreaming of these issues, the need to improve capacity, institutional capacity around monitoring and reporting. And so those things are consistent regardless of the product used, and so that needs to be tailored to the particular situation, but is focused on perhaps trying to identify some of the and work towards these institutional capacity constraints that can then be utilized sort of can be used whatever product is appropriate and whatever the circumstance for a different country.
Thank you, Patrick. Before Martin jumps in, let me play devil's advocate. But you mentioned there's no one size fits all, but you do believe that there's one composition and balance for least developing countries and landlocked countries that could be found.
No, I tend to think that these things are very bespoke. It's a question of, you know, there are different products and different countries choose. But essentially, what we are agreeing is that the SDGs are important for all the countries, and they're trying to work out solutions. And one of those solutions, or one of those things potentially off the rack, sits within financial markets, capital markets more broadly. So that's a solution. But I would put it that, you know, that's what we're agreeing, that essentially that the SDGs are important and all countries want to address those. And how to address those? Well, there are different products and choices, and they will have to be bespoke and work. But there are sort of common things that can strengthen their hand and assist them
to have more choices with the sort of products they would wish to engage with.
Thank you, Patrick. And over to Martin.
Yeah, thank you. I think there is not much to add. Patrick has covered it pretty well. I will maybe highlight the point on blended finance, which definitely may ease at the things in many cases. And also going back again to our mission at IFC, the private sector is definitely essential for leading the market transformation, and the role of commercial finance institutions is essential. I think we are also having help on the side of the market itself, because as you can see, development over the last 10-15 years in many areas, which 10 years ago seems to be almost unbankable and impossible to finance, like renewables, these days are much lower with their costs and financial needs in most of the markets, and this is true about all other aspects of sustainability. So I think this is also working in favor of getting things happening much faster and with low need for financing. But that's just a little reflection on this.
Thank you so much. Mindful of the time, I still would like to maybe ask a quick question to Yekaterina, if she can maybe give a bit of insight on sort of what the next big projects are to foster SDG process in Russia, what it would be sort of her take on the direction that would be particularly sustainable. Yekaterina, over to you.
Yeah, yes, thank you very much for the question. So I think that there are quite a number of projects. So you mentioned renewable energy, for example. So there are few projects in renewable sector. But overall, if you look at the structure of the Russian economy, apparently it's dominated by commodity exporters. And it's a tricky question when it comes to SDG. For example, not all of them can issue use of proceeds bonds. So that's why I mentioned that it's very important that the market infrastructure develops. We see new types of green bond financing, so that companies can get a little bit more flexibility in terms of instruments, so they can tap this market with new instruments. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you for sharing that. Again, mindful of the time, I have a couple of questions that I've noted down, but maybe we have an opportunity in the future to also get together and discuss those, because just as a quick summary, we touched on in the presentations and in the discussions also on the regulatory aspects, and also with the sort of concentration of or the current concentration of sort of climate bond issues, which is if I did not mishear, Patrick was saying is like a quarter of global bonds issued in that regard by China and Japan. And as we can sense also in this sort of reorganization, post-pandemic reorganization of maybe a global world order, such a concentration brings with it a number of crucial questions that need to be addressed from the various individual country perspectives, but also need to be assessed vis-a-vis sort of local capacities, independence, accountability questions, and again, as I said, regulatory questions. And Jens touched on that in sort of shifting the view towards sort of a needs-based finance approach. And I think it is very, very important in that regard that us as being in the countries or at the country level, working in the governments or working for the UN at the country level, that we really consider the needs of the countries that we're representing, and that we really take a needs-based approach aligned also with the local capacities and focus on building those local capacities. Towards sort of maybe less dependence on debt financing or concessional loans, or but more really formulating strong business cases on motivating equity to get engaged and really make it a strong case for innovation and economic development that is built that has this sustainability idea and sort of also maybe health idea built in, or climate change and health idea built into any of the endeavors. For me, what is left is I learned a lot during the session. I would like to say a big thank you to Patrick, to Martin, to Jens for their presentations that set the stage. But I wanted to also particularly value the reflections from the various country perspectives, from Azel, who has already left, unfortunately, from Yekaterina, from Nadia, and also from Søren, adding on to the governance question. I really, really appreciate your insights, and I think from the engagement of the audience and also Bulat's comment, I think there's a lot of questions we have left. And maybe there is indeed opportunity to continue this conversation. I'm kindly asking you not to leave yet, but I will give the floor to Natalia, and thanking also the organizers, Natalia and her team, and also extending again a big thank you to the translators. I apologize for speaking too fast. Your services were excellent and very, very helpful. Over to Natasha for the evaluation. I'm thanking the audience, everyone who's online. I'm thanking all the speakers, and I hope to have a future exchange of ideas and brainstorming with you soon. Come to Armenia. Over to you, Natasha.
Thank you so much, Denise, for your wonderful moderation in the session and for really bringing up also many of the needs that you see the country office in Armenia having as the UN and the international system is trying to support the government and other stakeholders in really finding comprehensive financing solutions. So I would just like to ask participants to complete the evaluation questionnaire, just like in the end of every session. The link has just been put into the chat, and we will give you about 2 minutes to complete it now. And then I just wanted to say that we look forward to see you all again at 3 p.m. local time Almaty for our final substantive session of this forum on partnership for the goals. So please, if you could take 2 minutes to complete this quick survey. Thank you so much, Denise. Thanks to all the speakers. Very interesting, insightful session, and indeed a lot to continue talking about.
Yeah, thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Okay, thanks everybody. I'm glad that we're having a longer break today before we move into the next session. See you in about an hour. Thank you.